The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
If you pay attention to this program, certainly you know about the right-wing obsession, both in terms of right-wing elected officials, right-wingers on the internet, and right-wing media with Benghazi, the attacks on September 11th of 2012 in Benghazi. The right continues to demand hearing after hearing. They're calling all sorts of conspiracy theories into, or asking that conspiracy theories be addressed or explained specifically. They campaign on Benghazi. They just go. Everything is Benghazi. And as it turns out, this is not just hyperbolic political posturing. It's also helping Republicans raise huge amounts of money. Media Matters did a comprehensive review of fundraising emails and campaign websites and fundraising websites and found that conservatives are regularly and consistently invoking Benghazi to ask people to give them money. The fundraising solicitations, of course, accuse President Obama and his administration of lies around Benghazi, cover-ups related to Benghazi, a dereliction of duty, crimes worse than Watergate in some examples. And the fundraising will probably intensify. There's now a House Select Committee led by Republican Trey Gowdy to investigate the Benghazi attacks. Reasonable Americans are probably saying, wait a second, yet another set of hearings related to Benghazi? Yes, another set of hearings related to Benghazi. So who are we talking about here? Fox News host Mike Huckabee, he sent out an email on May 6th to his Fox News promoted MikeHuckabee.com list. It was called Benghazi, Benghazi, Benghazi. That's not a joke. It literally was Benghazi, Benghazi, Benghazi. Huckabee claimed that Clinton has some explaining to do and that the Obama administration is responsible for Benghazi lies and cover-ups. Fox News contributor John Bolton, he sent out an email in mid-April, fundraising email for his John Bolton PAC. The title was Benghazi is a Disgrace. Bolton also sent out an email at the end of April in which he wrote that President Obama did nothing to avenge the murder of our ambassador Chris Stevens in Benghazi. Fox News contributor and Tea Partier Alan West, January 21st email for his, it's called the Alan West Guardian Fund PAC, Political Action Committee. He says there is an ongoing cover-up to hide the truth. Accuracy in Media, as recently as May 2nd, said after a year and a half of Benghazi damage control enforced by the administration and their lapdogs in the press, the genie is suddenly out of the bottle. We urge you to make a generous contribution today to fight this. And then the American Center for Law and Justice also demanding answers on Benghazi. So, Lewis, this has actually become not just a political posturing thing, but big bucks are being raised around pointing fingers on Benghazi.
Right. And for certain individual people and politicians, it's certainly not about money. It's just about destroying Obama by any means necessary. But of course, I can understand there being a cash grab here. Why not take advantage of people's emotions and confusion and misinformation and try to make a buck off of them too?
And what do you think, Lewis, would have happened if after one of the dozen or so similar incidents under George W. Bush, the Democrats at the time had started equally campaigning and making allegations and assertions related to one of those attacks? Do you think it would have gone the same way, or do you think maybe Republicans would have continued to pretend none of those dozen or so incidents were issues, as they did? They didn't care all throughout George W. Bush's 2 terms.
I'm sure they would have had some good reason for why it's different or why it was not an issue. But I bet you if Democrats did push it and investigate and make a big scene like Republicans are here, it probably would have been somewhat effective.
Remember that the family of Ambassador Chris Stevens, who was killed in the 9/11 2012 attacks in Benghazi, his family specifically asked that this tragedy not be used for political gain. I think that ship has sailed at this point. I've been talking for a long time about what I see as the 3 wings of the divided Republican Party. There's the low tax business side. They're mostly about limiting regulations on businesses, etc. There's the Tea Party, anarcho-libertarian, small government side. And then there is the evangelical, religious-based, mostly focused on social issues wing of the Republican Party. There's a really interesting article in today's Washington Post by Paul Waldman, where he argues there is no such division, there is no such fracturing in the Republican Party, and it uses as a backdrop the recent primaries in North Carolina, and it shows how there are some articles which say the Tea Party lost. It's very clear the Tea Party is not mainstream Republicanism. There is no split. The Tea Party is out. Or others that say, hey, the Tea Party won and the Republican Party at its core has kind of merged with the Tea Party. Both arguments are that there is not a division in the Republican Party. And then the article says, off the top of your head, can you name a significant substantive difference on an important policy matter between the GOP establishment and the Tea Party? I'll bet you can't. The disagreement between them is and has always been tactical. I completely disagree with this article, Lewis. This is not a good way of evaluating whether the Republican Party is split. Just because most Tea Partiers would have the same anti-gay view as most religious rightists doesn't mean that the party isn't divided, because the Tea Partiers certainly would value the issue of same-sex marriage differently than would the evangelical religious wing of the Republican Party. So just because they share points of view doesn't mean that they're motivated by the same issues, and thus that they would respond in the same way to certain types of Republicans. Eventually, we do get to the question as to whether these different groups would vote differently. And even there, the answer is yes, Lewis. Republicans, look at the last two presidential elections. The Republican Party ultimately, guided by the insiders of that party, chose Mitt Romney and John McCain in 2012 and 2008, respectively, as their presidential nominees. And people like Newt Gingrich were doing well up until close to the end. In spite of their countless incorrect positions on so many issues, Romney and McCain are of the more moderate Republicans today. At the same time, the Tea Party and evangelical wings of the Republican Party wanted people like Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, Ron Paul, all of whom did not do well in the Republican primaries. So, Lewis, I think that the difference, even though they may share views on individual issues, how they value issues and the worldview is different enough that they were supporting drastically different candidates in the last two elections.
Right. And look at it from the point of view of the voters. We know by listening to voters that certain voters are just not going to vote for someone from the Tea Party. Certain voters are not going to vote for a religious extremist. Certain Republican voters are not going to vote for these hardcore libertarians. How can you say the party isn't fractured when you have all these differences of opinion when it comes to voting for these people?
Now, ultimately, when we get to would any of these groups vote for a Democrat over the eventual Republican candidate, the answer is probably no. So on that, I wholeheartedly agree that we can debate or explore whether the fracturing affects the ability of Republicans to win in general elections. But to say the party isn't fractured just seems flat out wrong to me. If you disagree, tell me. Interesting situation going on with some new Republican Obamacare hearings. You're probably saying to yourself the same thing you were saying to yourself at the top of the show today about Benghazi hearings. We're still having hearings about Obamacare? Yes, we are. Republicans have been fighting against the Affordable Care Act for a long time. First, it was to say it was a communist socialist government takeover. Then it was to say that it was against the law. Then it was to say that we can't afford it. Then when it passed, they challenged it constitutionally. The Supreme Court upheld the law. Then they ran a campaign to simply repeal it and spent years trying to repeal it in Congress. Then they said, okay, that's not going to work. We're going to tell young people not to sign up. Young people signed up. So then they started calling for hearings, which is where we were this week. It's not clear what House Republicans wanted to get out of these hearings with health insurance executives, but it didn't really go very well. They apparently wanted to prove that Obamacare was failing, and what they wanted to say, what they wanted to get out of the health insurance executives was that all these people signing up for Obamacare, fine, they're signing up, but they're not paying for coverage, and therefore this is just not going to work. Unfortunately, the health insurance executives were basically on the same page, that about 80% of the people that signed up have actually paid the premiums and are up to date, are current on premium payments. And this went so badly for Republicans, ladies and gentlemen, that some of the Republicans in the hearings started to just kind of sneak out in the midst of the hearings. And I know people come and go all the time, but it was abundantly clear in this particular case, they were just not wanting to even be identified with hearings that were really saying nothing negative about the Affordable Care Act.
It's incredible. It's also incredible that this is still the goal of the Republican Party right now, basically obstructionism. And we're headed towards the midterms. I mean, I guess a lot of this is probably just political posturing. People think that this is going to get them reelected, but unfortunately, it looks like it might work too in a lot of cases.
It may work, but at the same time, Republicans were visibly exasperated as the insurers failed to confirm every single Obamacare nightmare story that was posited by the Republicans. But let's be totally clear. I don't really know why Republicans are so upset, because their own buddies, their plutocratic buddies in the big insurers, the private for-profit insurers that are tied in with Wall Street, which Republicans and most Democrats love, are reporting that they've got millions of new customers. You'd think this would make them happy.
Well, it's probably making the insurers happy, but I guess not so much the Republicans. But how many people are really watch this, or are reading up about it? I mean, it's probably pretty minuscule.
Yeah, you're probably right, although clips from this maybe will make it into campaign ads, and you know how the whole thing works, Lewis. I'm devastated and furious that none of those insurance executives were asked about what happened in Benghazi. Can you imagine, Lewis, a Republican-led hearing without questions about Benghazi, even if it is health insurance executives?
Hey, I wouldn't be surprised at all if some Republican tried to link Benghazi and Obamacare.
Things are still happening with Cliven Bundy's tax evading, gun-toting activism. I don't even know what to call it. Resistance in Nevada. And the latest is that the Utah Highway Patrol is investigating reports that a federal worker driving a Bureau of Land Management vehicle was threatened with a handgun earlier this week after anti-government rancher Cliven Bundy was recently accused of inciting militia members. BLM Fillmore Field Office Supervisor Eric Reed said to the Salt Lake Tribune that a federal Wrangler was driving on Interstate 15 on Tuesday when he encountered a dark blue Dodge 1500 extended cab pickup truck with two men who told him he was number one with that certain gesture, I guess referring to flipping the bird, Lewis. Within minutes, the truck returned, but this time the men were wearing hoods and holding a sign that said, "You need to die." Reed said that the federal worker wasn't able to record the license plate number because it had been covered with duct tape. And in an earlier interview with KLAS last week, Clark County Assistant Sheriff Joe Lombardo had accused Bundy of inciting militia members, supporting him to use violence. All over this country, we hear stories of unarmed individuals shot by police because they might have had a gun, they alluded to having a gun, they had a comb that looked like it could have been a gun. And at the same time, we have militia members straight up pointing guns at federal authorities, accompanied by straight up threats, nonstop threats and implied violence at any moment. And we don't have anybody retaliated against. I just don't understand what's happening.
I think this is all intimidatory. I think these guys know exactly what's going to happen as soon as they pull the trigger. They're going to lose.
But Lewis, that's not a great argument, because if you just point a gun at a police officer, you get shot. So just saying, hey, they're just intimidating. I understand what you're saying. There may not really be a risk of getting shot. But from the point of view of the police officers and the federal authorities, where are the Homeland Security vans? Why aren't they showing up here?
This is a different situation because it's a media situation. There are cameras, there are news reporters. It's different than when you're in some dimly lit parking lot in the middle of Detroit and you think someone might be pointing a gun at you there with no cameras around. Different situation.
Occupy Wall Street protester gets prison time for pushing a cop. Bundy's gun-toting militia threatens government workers with guns and intimidates locals, and they get tons of time in the news, a lot of it actually positive. Last time I checked, hooded snipers on a federal highway were known as terrorists, not heroes to be applauded by anybody. But that's what's happening, at least in some areas of society.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what the media can do. This is a true testament to the power of media.
Join us on Reddit, davidpakman.com/Reddit, REDDIT. We'll take a break and be back right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is your best source for unbiased news because conservatives know that you reduce the abortion rate by keeping birth control away from women while teaching abstinence-only sex education. If that sounds unbiased to you, you need liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is David Wedler. David, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. A lot of Davids in the last month actually joining the David Pakman Show membership ranks, and you have 24 hours left to sign up for a yearly membership and get a free t-shirt. You have to know where to go, and that's davidpakman.com/5daysnow, the number 5 days now, 24 hours before the debut of the Friday show, and at that point, the free t-shirt deal ends, so it's time to take care of that. Let me give you a recommendation today. Today, it is a documentary called Surviving Progress. It's a film that's kind of loosely based on a short history of progress, which is, so it's based on, actually, not only that, it's based on a short history of progress, a book, and a 2004 Massey lecture series by Ronald Wright about societal collapse. It is very, very good. It's well put together. And it kind of addresses the downfalls of so-called progress. And it looks at how what has been considered progress historically has often brought new problems and has required new solutions societally. And most interestingly, it explores what could happen if so-called progress in certain areas continues unfettered into the future. And Lewis, this is very interesting to me because it's not really a population growth sustainability angle. It's more societal progress, right? And when we think about, if you look at the history of Homo sapiens, right, and consider the types and quantity and magnitude of progress over the last 150 and 25 years and the accelerating rate of so-called progress, there are real questions about what will happen 150 years from now even. Forget about 1,000 years from now.
Those are good questions. If we even make it that far, of course, some countries are progressing, some countries are regressing. It's very interesting.
And this, of course, goes beyond not only, it looks at the country level, but it looks more at also the human race level. So again, this is Surviving Progress. It streams on Netflix. I highly recommend it. You can also find it all over the internet, I am sure. HGTV has decided to cancel a show because the would-be hosts turned out to be xenophobic anti-gay twins. Not every day that's the story you get. Earlier this year, there was the huge controversy over the resignation of CEO of Mozilla, Brendan Eich, after news surfaced that he made an anti-gay donation to Proposition 8 in California. And of course, that resignation was not a free speech issue, in spite of right-wingers trying to make it that. In fact, the government wasn't involved at all. It was simply a business decision. Still, it didn't stop the anti-gay crowd from saying that he had been bullied, that his free speech rights were being violated. Clearly a fundamental misunderstanding of what free speech is. We also had that situation where Phil Robertson from Duck Dynasty made some anti-gay comments in a print interview. A&E initially suspended him, then brought him back. Again, no free speech issue. Everybody got to say whatever they wanted. Sometimes your speech has consequences, and business decisions were made. Now we have a similar situation with the TV channel HGTV, which is Home and Garden Television. They're known for these real estate and home-related programs of different kinds. They said they were going to launch a new show about flipping houses, and it was going to be hosted by twins named David and Jason Benham, not Bonham Lewis, not Jason Bonham, of course, the son of the great drummer John Bonham from Led Zeppelin. There is absolutely no similarity whatsoever. We're talking about David and Jason Benham here. The show was going to launch in October. It was going to be called Flip It Forward. Now, the network, which is owned by Scripps Network Interactive, abruptly announced they're dropping the show after word started to spread that the twin hosts of the show are incredibly anti-gay and xenophobic. HGTV has, quote, decided not to move forward with the Benham's Brother series. David Benham once led a prayer rally called Charlotte 714, organized with his twin brother outside the 2012 Democratic National Convention in Charlotte to protest, quote, abortion on demand, no-fault divorce, pornography, perversion, adultery, demonic ideologies, and other issues that were taught at public schools and universities. Here is audio of David Benham going off about the so-called gay agenda. The gay agenda, Lewis. Imagine that.
Realize that, okay, if 87% of Americans are Christians, and yet we have abortion on demand, we have no-fault divorce, we have pornography and perversion, we have a homosexuality in the agenda that's attacking the nation, we have adultery, we have all of the things. I mean, we even have allowed demonic ideologies to take our universities, our public school systems, while the church sits silent and just builds big churches.
All right, this guy is completely sickening. That was on some kind of Christian radio program hosted by Jane Mefford. He also serves on the board of the Anti-LGBT Coalition of Conscience, and they are the sons of Flip Benham, who's a leader of the abortion clinic protest group Operation Save America, which split off from a militant anti-abortion group called Operation Rescue in the late 90s. This is ignorance on parade. I'm glad they canceled the show. HGTV has a record of LGBT inclusion in their programming. Often on their House Hunters show, the couple that's looking for a home is a same-sex couple. No mention is made of it. It's just not a big deal. It's not a part of the show. Right-wing extremists like the Benham twins just wouldn't be good for business for HGTV. That's it, plain and simple.
I agree. Yeah, it is purely a business decision, but these guys look like they might have a bright future on Pat Robertson's channel or something like that, right?
Yeah, and they came out today and they said, anybody who thinks we hate gay people doesn't know what they're talking about. And this is this tired, old, ridiculous statement about how they don't hate gay people. They want to save gay people. We've heard it a million times, haven't we?
We have. A million, that's an understatement.
Brian Fisher from the American Family Association wants to ban profanity in the U.S., just like in Russia. The American right wing seems completely confused about freedom of speech and the First Amendment, as we talked about in the Mozilla case, as we talked about in the HGTV anti-gay twins getting their show canceled case. And they now seem to be also confused about it on the other side. This is Brian Fisher. And he says that actually limitations on speech that prevent the use of swear words or pornographic language or blasphemy are actually okay. Wow, what a surprise. Listen to Brian Fisher here.
Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not endorsing everything that Vladimir Putin does. I need to issue that caveat right up front. He's wrong on Crimea. He's wrong on the Ukraine. He is right about homosexuality, and he is right about profanity. And the reality is, we could institute a ban on profanity, or blasphemy for that matter, without violating the First Amendment. A ban on profanity is not a violation of the First Amendment. Why? Because the First Amendment was crafted by the founders to protect political speech. It wasn't written to protect profanity, obscenity, vulgarity, or pornography. Let me repeat. The free speech plank of the First Amendment was written to protect political speech, political debate. It was not written to protect pornography, vulgarity, obscenity, or pornography.
What is this? This is simple-minded, Puritan type thinking. It ignores the obvious question of who decides what words are profane. Is it the FCC, 7 dirty words? What standard is used? How can someone like Brian Fisher, who is supposedly against limitations on freedom of speech by the government, even if it comes to being forced to stay as the Mozilla CEO in spite of making anti-gay donations that offend everybody and make you not a good candidate for the job, that same person seems to think banning swearing is perfectly acceptable. The only explanation I can think of, Lewis, is that he assumes it's the Christians who will decide what's profane and what's blasphemous.
We know he thinks that the Bible is the decision maker, that all decisions should be based off of the Bible. And make no mistake, we all know that if Brian Fisher had his way, this country would be no different than Afghanistan, except maybe with more television. That'd probably be it.
All right. So we now have seen both sides of the First Amendment free speech insanity that has plagued this country. We saw it in the cases of Brandon Ike, and we see it with the HGTV situation, A&E with Phil Robertson from the reality type show Duck Dynasty. And then now, on the other hand, it's fine for the government to actually just ban swear words. No problem at all. Richard Wolff, economist and my former economics professor, will join us next to talk about the New York Times article that has caused a lot of controversy, pointing out that the American middle class is no longer the richest middle class in the world. That's next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Joining us today is Richard Wolff. He's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, also a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Professor Wolff, we talked about this New York Times article, which outlined how in spite of the American middle class being the wealthiest in the world for a long time, this is no longer the case. The article also looked at how the American poor are less well off than the poor in many European countries considered to be at a similar level of development as is the U.S. The New York Times article posited 3 different reasons for why this may be the case, but without going to those, I'll go to you. If you analyze the data, what would your view be as to why there has been this downfall in terms of the middle class in the U.S.?
Well, I think the answer lies at the intersection of economics and politics, something that neither discipline by itself is usually able to grasp. If you pushed me and asked fundamentally the single most important reason, I would have to say that it's the history of the United States and Britain on the one hand versus that of continental Europe on the other. And the central reality is that during the Great Depression of the 1930s, in Europe, in England, in the United States, there was, with the exception of the fascist responses in Germany and Italy, a kind of dramatic swing to the left. The creation of what we call Social Security, unemployment compensation, a vast program of public employment. These were responses to a depression that helped the middle class really become the so-called middle class. It took care of average people and poor people, and it taxed corporations and the rich to do that. That was done in France. That was done in the northern European countries, Scandinavia. It was done later on after the war in Germany and Italy as well. So you had the kind of New Deal, let's call it, that we had in this country replicated there. But after the war, a dramatic change. In the United States and also in Britain, but particularly in the United States, there was a massive movement to undo the coalition of labor unions, progressive intellectuals, socialists, communists, all of that bubble that had produced the demand for a New Deal from below, both here and in continental Europe. In the United States and England, that coalition was attacked and largely destroyed. Communists and socialists were converted from militants demanding a more equal society into evil agents of a foreign power, a very standard way to destroy internal dissent. We did that in the United States very successfully, and followed that by a long, slow, but very successful decimation of the labor movement. At the end of World War II, for example, more than a third of workers in the private sector in the United States were members of a union. Today, less than 7% of private sector workers are in a union. So the bottom line is, without a militant movement from below, without a strong labor movement, you do not have the political force to require that the growth of the economy be shared. Maybe not equally, but at least to some degree shared not only by the rich, but also by the middle and by the bottom. The reality of the United States, which is true more than it's true even in England, which is close to us, and way more than in Europe, is we were able to destroy the political forces that would have required corporations and the rich to share the wealth. And as a result, they don't share it. They haven't for 30 to 40 years. They can't do that in places like Germany, France, Scandinavia. They might like to, but they can't. The political situation is that their labor unions are relatively much stronger than ours. They have functioning socialist parties. Many of them have functioning communist or other anti-capitalist parties. And together, they create the political power that means capitalism cannot indulge its normal tendency to produce wealth polarized at one end and no middle and everybody else toward the bottom at the other. And I might mention that there's a big splash these days over a new book by a French economist named Thomas Piketty. And the irony is that book documents how and why capitalism can indeed, for long periods of time, polarize wealth and poverty, making a tiny minority very rich and the vast majority in more or less economic difficulty. It comes at a time when this needs to be understood so that Americans particularly, where the book has had the biggest splash of all, can begin to understand the structural problems they face when they talk about a disappearing middle class.
Well, it seems that there's a general lack of awareness of the history of so-called supply-side economic theory and demand-side economic theory. And I've had this conversation with many guests on this program. And when you look at, even if we just pull out the last 100 or 120 years in the United States and you explore, well, what can we say definitively about what supply-side economic theory has done for us in the United States, cutting taxes to the rich and corporations with the idea that it will trickle down, versus the idea of demand-side economics, stimulus, making it so that the middle and lower classes have the money with which to purchase products and services. Don't the numbers, don't the facts and figures support the idea that we know for sure that demand-side economics works, and we don't really have evidence that supply-side economics actually functions the way we're told?
Well, I guess I would politely and in a minor way disagree with you, David. And let me tell you why.
Yeah.
I'm no great devotee of supply-side economics, heaven knows. The notion that by making business more profitable, a wondrous result of economic well-being for everybody will follow,
right,
is contradicted both theoretically and empirically. It is easy to tell and show people that we had much higher taxes on corporations and the rich in the 50s and 60s than we do today, but that we also had much lower levels of unemployment and much higher rates of economic growth at that time. And that the period since then of lowering the taxes on corporations and the rich, instead of putting us in a better economic situation, have basically put us in a worse one particularly in the crash in 2008 and the years since.
So far, we agree.
Right. But here comes my answer on the demand side. I think it's equally theoretically and empirically highly questionable whether boosting demand from the bottom is some kind of magical way to get well-being and prosperity. It's very easy in a capitalist system, if you give a lot of money to people at the bottom, one way or another, that the employers, the ones who set prices and the ones who have an extraordinary power over wages, will be able to respond, not that we want them to, but are able in this system to respond to your demand side stimulus by pulling the money, in effect, out of the hands of the middle and the lower, and thereby, once again, putting the economy in a bad situation, a period of stagnation, and so on. So for me, I prefer demand side, but not because it's a better stimulus in the long run, but because I think it's the more democratic way to go. If you help people at the bottom, even if in the end the stimulus effect you look for doesn't follow, you've at least done a very good thing, which has helped the mass of people, which every economic system ought to do if it's democratic, and you hope that'll be a good result. But even in the meantime, when there isn't, you've done a good thing and helped people get through a hard economic time in a way that builds solidarity, strengthens the community, and is the decent and right thing to do.
So would it be fair to say then that while the demand side versus supply side economic debate would not fundamentally change the broader system that we have, it could, at least in the short and medium term, somewhat reduce inequality and lift up the lower classes of society, which we could argue certainly is a positive thing?
Absolutely. There, I have no disagreement with you. That's why I would support the demand side relative to supply side, because of its actual real social effects. Where I can't go along, and where I find the debate, frankly, rather sterile as well as endless, is that this kind of an argument implicitly assumes that the basic structure of the economy is both permanent and not a problem. So that we just have to get right whether you stimulate it from the supply side or you stimulate it from the demand side. For me, the problem of stimuli from either side is that they confront a structure which has built into it socially unproductive and fundamentally undemocratic mechanisms and results. And that's what I want to see debated more and more centrally important than another argument about why stimulus from below is better than stimulus from above.
All right, Professor Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, visiting professor here in New York City at New School University. Pleasure as always to have you.
Thank you, David, and I look forward to our next conversation.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The Movoto Real Estate blog analyzed some data about the most stressed out cities in the United States. They decided the most important factors that contribute to people's stress in cities are commute time, unemployment, high cost of living, crime per capita, hours worked, population density, and the percentage of income spent on rent. And they sourced publicly available data from the U.S. Census American Community Survey from 2008 to 2012. And starting with the most stressed city in the country, I'm going to give you the top ones. We have Washington, D.C., New York, Miami, San Francisco, Jersey City, New Jersey, Oakland, California, Chicago, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Los Angeles. Now, I agree with some of these factors, right? Commute time is a factor in stress. However, it is known that commuting X number of minutes in a car is a different level of stress than commuting X number of minutes on the subway. In other words, a 40-minute car commute to me sounds horrific. But 40 minutes on the subway, and that's way more than my commute here in New York City, doesn't sound quite as bad, because if you take into consideration you're waiting, you're on the subway, you're off the subway, you're reading on the subway, we have to distinguish a little bit here, I think, Lewis.
That's an interesting point you're making. I'm the opposite. I think a 40-minute car ride sounds much better than a 40-minute subway ride.
Well, so again, maybe even more illustration that we need to be distinguishing here. Also, if you base your decision on cities based on these factors, you should probably be living, I think the study says, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, absolutely no offense whatsoever to Lincoln, Nebraska, but there are many other reasons not taken into consideration by this study why Lincoln, Nebraska is not nearly as desirable a place to live as these other cities, and that's ignored here.
It is, but I mean, if you're purely talking about stress levels, do you need to factor that in?
Absolutely, because to many people, what would be stressful is living in a city that you feel has no culture. You're living in a city that has no food culture. You're living in a food desert chain city with no arts and entertainment, and physically isolated in the middle of the country, for example. It depends on what's important to one or another, right?
But I don't know if being bored is a source of stress. I mean, I think you could be bored and unhappy, but I don't think that would equate to stress.
Well, again, it seems to be mostly a semantic thing, right? If you have higher life satisfaction, it stands to reason you will be less stressed by some of the factors identified here. To me, it seems very arbitrary the way this was done, and maybe I'm biased,
You could very well be biased, but we won't say that with certitude, because it could harm the show.
What about cities that would come out less stressful based on this study, but have terrible infrastructure or healthcare or education and public services? They would still seem very not stressful, but at the same time, poor healthcare, bad education, these are systemic stressors, right?
Would I be correct in assuming that you have accepted to deal with certain stressful things just to live in New York City, to have the benefits of New York City as well?
Well, to call them stressful or not, I guess, is where the debate is. Like for me, commuting on the subway is really not a big deal. I have my car here. When I go up to Massachusetts, I drive, but when I'm here, I take the subway. It's not a stressor, so to speak, right? The high cost of living comes in exchange for things I find to be positive. So yeah, I mean, certainly everybody has a different barometer, I think.
Fair enough. Yeah, we can agree on that.
Let's go to your voicemails. 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail about yesterday's crazy racist voicemail. Listen to this.
Hey, Dave. Hey, Lewis. David. This is Kurt down here in Atlanta. Just got done listening to your show. Today's the 7th of May. The crazy voicemail at the end of the show, it kind of sounds like that gay racist dude, Gordon. Yeah. Kind of sounds like him.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't. I think I know. The caller in that voicemail didn't identify himself yesterday, but it's someone who has called the show before, and it's someone from the southeast of the United States. In case I'm completely wrong on voice analysis here, I won't identify them specifically, but it was not the so-called gay racist guy, Gordon. Here's one more voicemail for you to listen
Dave,
to.
Are the Jonah Orthodox Jews who force gay teens to beat off in front of them the same ones who perform a bris by sucking the bloody penis of a week-old baby boy? Just saying.
Yeah.
Hashtag Brooklyn Jews. That's where you live, brother. I love religion. Follow.
Yeah, it's. I don't know anything about whether that there's a connection between that group, the anti-gay group Jonah, and the circumcisions that are done apparently with mouth contact to the penis. I've actually never met or spoken to anyone, Lewis, who even knows someone who had that type of circumcision done. I don't know if that's different for you, but in all of my travels in my 30 years, I've heard of it as something that exists, but I've never actually heard of or talked to anyone specifically who has any knowledge of it.
Yeah, I think it's pretty rare, but we do know that it does happen. And that's it's no good, David. It's got to stop.
It's complete and utter insanity. There's no question of that. Excellent bonus show coming up today. We're going to talk about Mexican cartels diversifying. A Massachusetts town lifts a 32-year arcade game ban. Is Lewis moving there? We'll ask him. And a band trolls Spotify for $20,000 in licensing fees. DavidPakman.com/membership. And for the next 24 hours only, davidpakman.com/5daysnow, that's the number 5 days now, for a free t-shirt with your yearly membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.